Welcome to the module, Receiving Exceptions. We walked through the steps for a perfect receiving scenario during the last module. As we all know, not all purchase orders will be received perfectly. There are many different types of receiving exceptions, such as partial receiving, price change, and substitutions. Bird Street allows the receiver to mimic these exceptions. In this module, we will go over the steps on how to handle these exceptions. Just like the last module, let's use a scenario to better illustrate the receiving exceptions. We are going to bring back John, the chef admin. For today's example, sous chef Mo created a cookware purchase order in Bird Street a few days ago. The items are physically received today, and the paperwork is provided to John for electronic receiving. John will start the process by locating the Bird Street purchase order number on the paperwork. For today's example, let's assume the paperwork provided by the supplier is the invoice. Sometimes the supplier provides the invoice at the time of delivery. Other times, a packing slip might be provided instead. As we saw in the previous module, John can go to the purchase order page and find the purchase order by searching the purchase order number. After locating the correct PO, which button will John click on to initiate the receiving process in Bird Street? John will click on the Receive button to access the receiving screen. John can enter the required received date fields in the PO header Receiving tab. He will click on the Line Items tab next to enter the detailed receiving information at the line level. The Line Items tab is where John will document the exceptions. We learned in the previous module that John can change both the accepted quantity and invoice price column. That's exactly what he will do for today's exception. The Bird Street receiver should always enter the pricing from the invoice or quantity on the packing slip, even if it's not what is reflected on the purchase order. Let's review 4 different types of exception using this PO. John is going to replicate the physical receiving event in Bird Street. For the purchase order today, the first line item, 16 compartment cup rack, was delivered. However, only 2 of the 4 racks ordered were delivered today. If that's the case, all John has to do is enter a quantity of 2 in the accepted quantity column for the item. For the first line item, John received 2 out of 4 cup racks. John will be able to receive the remaining 2 when they are delivered at a later time. But what would John do if he knows the remaining quantities will never show up? Let's review how to enter this in Bird Street by looking at the second item. For the second item, the aerating wine funnel with screen, 5 out of 10 funnels ordered were delivered. In this case, the item was marked on the invoice with the note, "Out of stock." If that's the case, the remaining 5 funnels will never be delivered. John can mark this in the system by inputting 5 in the accepted quantity column and then checking the Cancel Remaining Quantity checkbox for the particular item. John will only do this if he knows the remaining quantity will never be delivered. Note: clicking the Cancel Remaining checkbox does not notify the supplier of the cancellation. Remember, John can also change the price of an item during receiving. This might happen when the supplier didn't update its catalog in Birch Street, so the purchase order price doesn't match with the invoice. John will change the price for the third item since the price for the cast iron pan is no longer $62.28. It is now $63.99. John can update the price by changing the invoice price column for the item. The final exception example for today's module is substitution. The invoice states the fourth item on the purchase order was a substitution. The supplier delivered the 6-inch cast iron pan instead of the originally requested 6 1/4 inch pan. This is an acceptable substitute. John will be able to indicate the substitution by clicking on the edit link next to the item. This will bring up an additional section below the item. Here, John can check the substitution checkbox and input the substitution item information. John can click the OK button to save the substitution. John will then enter 1 in the accepted quantity field. Notice the substitution item information will not be displayed here. We will go over exactly where John can track this information in just a bit. For the last item, John will receive it perfectly, since everything showed up at the same quantity and price. Now John has replicated the physical receiving exceptions into Birch Street. He will finalize the receiving event by clicking on the Receive button. A pop-up will notify John the receiving event is processed. John can review the receiving event by clicking on the Receiving Record button. The Receiving Record screen will pop up displaying the details of the receiving event. Notice here all the partially received, canceled, price change, and the substitution are clearly marked. This is a great place to review the receiving details. This purchase order is now at a partially received status because some of the items have not been completely received yet. John can receive the remaining items when the second delivery eventually arrives on property. The Birch Street purchase orders can be received multiple times. The ability to have multiple receiving events for one PO is one of the key receiving features in Birch Street. Let us summarize what we have learned so far. Birch Street receivers can replicate any physical receiving exceptions in the system. The receiver can leave a PO open for additional receiving events or cancel the remaining quantity during partial receiving. Cancel the remaining quantity only when the remaining quantity will never be delivered. For example, discontinued items. The receiver can update the item price during receiving. A substitution item can be inputted by clicking on the edit link next to the line item and inputting the substitution item information. The receiving record screen will display the detailed information and changes made during the receiving event.